Before we begin today's story, I want to welcome you here. If you enjoy listening to true stories from the past, filled with life lessons, emotions, and moments that make you think, consider subscribing. It means a lot, and it helps me keep sharing stories like this one. And right now, before the story unfolds, I'd love if you could pause for just a second and write in the comments where you're watching from. Are you somewhere warm, maybe by the sea? Or are you listening late at night in a quiet town? I truly love to see how far these stories travel from one heart to another. Now, today's story is not an easy one. In fact, it's one of the hardest I've ever told. It's about kindness, sacrifice, and betrayal. It's about giving everything you have to others, only to watch them close the door in your face when you need them most. If you stay until the end, you'll hear how it all unfolded, how I, an ordinary woman, carried someone else's burden until my knees gave way, and how, in return, they erased me from their life as if I had never existed. Please listen closely, because the truth is, this could happen to any of us. I still remember the very first day I met them. It was late autumn, the kind of afternoon when the air smells like wood smoke and the leaves crunch under your shoes. I was walking back from the market, holding a paper bag with bread and a small jar of honey. My joints were aching that day. I was already well into my 60s, and every step reminded me that time doesn't slow down. Their house was just across the narrow street from mine. A modest little home with peeling paint and a porch that sagged under the weight of years. I had seen them before. An older couple, about my age, though frailer, quieter. They didn't mix much with neighbors. People said the husband's health was failing. Some whispered about debts, about how they barely made ends meet. That afternoon, as I passed, I saw her, his wife, struggling to lift a heavy bag of potatoes up the steps. She was small, her hands thin, the bones showing like branches in winter. I put my groceries down on the fence and hurried across. "Let me help you," I said, already reaching for the bag. She looked at me, surprised, as if she wasn't used to kindness. "Oh, no, no, it's too heavy," she whispered, but her arms trembled, and I knew she couldn't carry it another step. Together we managed to bring the sack inside. The house smelled faintly of medicine and damp cloth. On the couch lay her husband, pale, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. A blanket was pulled up to his chin, though his skin still looked cold. His eyes flickered toward me for just a moment and then shut again. That was the first time I entered their world. And I didn't know then how deep I would be drawn into it. The days that followed were simple at first. I would stop by with soup or bread, sometimes just to ask how they were doing. She always thanked me politely, but there was a distance, a kind of shame in her voice. I understood it well. People don't like feeling like a burden. But as winter grew colder, her husband's health worsened. I could see it in her face, in the way her shoulders bent lower each time I met her at the gate. One evening, after I had tucked my groceries away, I heard a faint knock at my door. It was her, tears in her eyes, voice trembling. "Could you come? He's having a hard time breathing." I didn't think twice. I grabbed my coat and followed her. Inside, he was gasping, struggling like a man drowning on dry land. I propped him up, rubbed his back, told her to fetch water. I wasn't a nurse, I had no training, but I knew how to stay calm when someone else couldn't. After a long, agonizing hour, his breathing eased a little. She sank into the chair beside him, clutching his hand. Her eyes met mine, filled with relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done." From that night on, I became more than a neighbor. I became a helper, a caregiver, a quiet shadow in their home. Every morning I would check in before tending to my own chores. Sometimes I washed their dishes, sometimes I mended clothes. And when her husband's coughing shook the walls at midnight, she knew she could knock on my door, and I would come. It wasn't easy. My own body was frail. My knees hurt, my back ached, and at times I wondered why I pushed myself so hard. But something inside me kept saying, "If not you, then who?" And so, day after day, I gave more of myself. At first, I thought it was only temporary, just until he got a little better. But the weeks stretched into months, and the seasons changed. Their need for me grew, and my own life began to shrink around it. Friends called, inviting me for tea, and I declined. My small garden went untended, the weeds taking over. My own health appointments were postponed again and again, because they need me more. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the first mistake. Not the kindness itself, but forgetting that kindness must also include ourselves. Because once you give everything, some people stop seeing it as a gift. They start seeing it as something they're owed. I didn't know then that this path I had chosen, the path of sacrifice, would lead me to the coldest moment of my life. A moment when, after everything I had done, the only sound I heard was a door slamming shut in my face. But that part of the story will come later. The weeks became a rhythm of their own. Morning began, not with my own breakfast, but with a knock on their door. Sometimes I would find her already awake, sitting in the kitchen with her head resting on her hands, eyes swollen from crying through the night. The house always smelled faintly of damp cloth and boiled potatoes. They didn't have much, and I could tell they hadn't eaten well in days. I started bringing food whenever I could, a pot of soup, bread, sometimes a jar of jam if I had managed to get a little extra at the market. I wasn't wealthy myself, but there's something about watching someone else go hungry that makes you forget your own needs. She always said the same words. "Oh, you shouldn't have." But she never refused. I could see the relief in her eyes when she placed the bowls on the table and fed her husband. One afternoon, as I wiped the counter after helping her wash dishes, she said quietly, "You remind me of my sister. She passed away years ago. She was the only one who ever helped me like this." I didn't know what to say. I simply put a hand on hers and gave a small smile. From that moment, I knew I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I had stepped into a role that felt almost like family. Her husband's condition worsened slowly, cruelly. Some days he could sit up and mutter a few words. Other days he was so weak he couldn't even hold a spoon. On those days, I fed him myself, carefully lifting the spoon to his lips. His eyes would meet mine, tired but grateful, and sometimes he would squeeze my hand faintly. I began staying longer. At first, just an hour, then 2, then entire afternoons. She started relying on me for things she hadn't asked before. Picking up medicine from the pharmacy, cleaning the linens, even managing the bills when she couldn't face them. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. But little by little, I began to feel the weight. My knees hurt more from standing at their sink. My nights grew shorter, because the moment I closed my eyes, I worried, what if they need me? I had lived a quiet, simple life with my books and my small garden. Suddenly, my life wasn't my own anymore. One evening, I returned home after a long day at their house. I sank into my chair, too tired even to eat. The walls of my house felt colder, emptier. My kettle whistled, but I didn't have the strength to get up and pour the tea. That was the first night I whispered aloud, "Will anyone ever do this for me when my time comes?" The question hung in the silence, heavier than I expected. Still, I didn't stop. I told myself that the exhaustion was just part of kindness, that God sees, even if people don't. I reminded myself of the way she looked at me sometimes, as if I were her only anchor in the storm. And perhaps I was, because one night in January, a storm truly came. The wind howled through the cracks of their windows, and the snow piled up against the door. Their small stove struggled to keep the house warm. He was feverish, sweating, yet shivering at the same time. She called me in panic, and I trudged through the snow with blankets, medicine, and hot tea. I stayed the entire night, sitting on the edge of their bed, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. She dozed in the chair beside me, too weak to keep watch herself. I didn't sleep at all. I just listened to his ragged breathing, counting every rise and fall of his chest, terrified that one of them would be the last. When dawn finally came, and the storm outside calmed, he was still alive. Barely, but alive. She opened her eyes, saw me still there, and began to cry softly. "You saved him," she whispered. I didn't answer. I just held her hand. But inside, something twisted. Because I knew the truth. I wasn't saving him. I was simply delaying what was inevitable. Still, from that day forward, she clung to me even more. Every knock on my door was filled with urgency. Every glance carried unspoken words. "Don't leave me alone in this." And so I gave more. More time, more energy, more of myself. I cancelled appointments for my own health. I let the weeds take my garden, let my own cupboards run empty. My world shrank to theirs. The other neighbors noticed. Some whispered about how much time I spent there. A friend once told me, "They're using you." But I shook my head. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself this was love. This was community. This was what life was meant to be. But in the back of my mind, I felt the cracks forming. Every act of kindness drained something from me that wasn't being replenished. I smiled for them, but when I returned home, I sat in the darkness and felt the loneliness gnawing at me. And still, I went back the next morning. Because that's what you do when you've tied your life to someone else's survival. I didn't know then that gratitude can be fragile, and that kindness, if given too freely, can be forgotten. But I was about to learn, because even as I poured everything I had into them, the seeds of betrayal were already growing in the silence between us. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted into heavy mud, and the first flowers pushed their way through the cold soil. But inside their home, there was no sign of renewal. His condition grew worse. His cough became deeper, his strength almost gone. She rarely left his side, and when she did, it was usually to call for me. By now, my days revolved almost entirely around them. I rose in the morning, made myself a small cup of tea, and then crossed the street to see what needed to be done. Sometimes it was cooking, sometimes cleaning, sometimes just sitting by his bedside so she could rest for an hour. At first, they thanked me constantly. She would say, "You're an angel. We couldn't do this without you." He would grasp my hand with what little strength he had and whisper, "Bless you." But as weeks turned to months, the words grew fewer. The gratitude faded, little by little, like the color draining from a photograph. My presence became expected, not appreciated. I remember one particular afternoon. I had spent hours scrubbing their floors, washing linens, and preparing a broth. My back ached so badly that I could barely straighten up. When she came into the kitchen, I hoped she might notice the effort. Instead, she looked at the pot and said flatly, "You didn't put enough salt. He won't eat it like this." Her words stung, not because of the salt, it was a small thing, but because it was the first time she spoke to me without kindness. I forced a smile, adjusted the seasoning, and told myself she was just tired. But a small seed of doubt settled in my chest. Soon, those small moments became more frequent. I would bring groceries, and instead of "thank you," she would ask why I hadn't brought more. I would stay up late helping through one of his coughing fits, and in the morning, she would complain that I had left a chair out of place. At night, when I returned to my own home, I sat in silence and wondered, did they forget who I am? Did they forget that I'm here because I chose to be, not because I have to? Still, I kept going back. Perhaps I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. Perhaps I couldn't bear the thought of them facing such darkness alone. One evening, after I had finished preparing a meal, she looked at me suddenly and asked, "Why do you help us so much? What do you want from us?" Her tone was sharp, suspicious. I stood frozen, the ladle still in my hand. "I don't want anything," I whispered. "I just care." She didn't respond. She turned away, muttering something I couldn't hear. But the question haunted me. Was my kindness now seen as a burden, or worse, as something with hidden motives? It was around that time that I began noticing the way other neighbors looked at me. Some avoided my eyes, as if my closeness with them made them uncomfortable. Others whispered in the street, though they never said anything directly to me. The isolation grew heavier. Then came the night that nearly broke me. He had been especially weak, unable to move without help. I stayed until dawn, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. When the first light crept through the curtains, I finally stood to leave, exhausted beyond words. She followed me to the door. Instead of saying goodbye or thank you, she sighed and said, "You always look so tired. Maybe you shouldn't come so often if it's too much for you." The words cut deeper than she realized. Too much for me? I had given up almost everything to be there. My body ached, my spirit was worn thin, and yet I kept showing up. And now, instead of gratitude, I felt as though my presence was almost an annoyance. That morning, I walked back to my own house with heavy steps. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the worn wood, and for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake. But the guilt was stronger than the doubt. I told myself they were scared, overwhelmed, drowning in grief before grief had even finished its work. People don't always act kindly when they're afraid. I convinced myself to forgive, to forget, to keep going. And so I did. Day after day, I went back. I cooked, I cleaned, I held his hand when he shook with fever. I let her rest while I stayed awake through the long hours of night. But deep inside me, the silence grew louder. A silence made of all the words that were never spoken, all the gratitude that was never shown, all the small slights that piled up like stones on my chest. I knew something was changing. I could feel it, like a storm building on the horizon. And though I didn't want to admit it, I feared that the kindness I had given so freely would not return to me in the way I hoped. I didn't know then just how true that fear would become. Summer arrived, but their house remained cold. Not from the weather, it was warm enough outside, but from the heaviness that filled its walls. By now, his strength had nearly vanished. He spent his days in bed, his breath shallow, his eyes half closed. She hardly left his side, and I, as always, was there, moving quietly through their home like a shadow, keeping everything together as best I could. But something between us had shifted. I could feel it in the way she looked at me, the way her words landed sharper than before. Where once she had seen me as a lifeline, now it seemed she saw me as a reminder of weakness, of need, of everything in her life that was slipping away. One afternoon, I arrived with a small basket of fresh vegetables from the market. I had walked all the way across town to get them, knowing her husband hadn't eaten well in days. When I set the basket on the table, she frowned. "Why did you buy so little? This won't last." I swallowed my disappointment, forcing a calm smile. "It was all I could carry," I said softly. She didn't answer. She just turned away, muttering under her breath. For the first time, I didn't follow her. I stood in that kitchen, staring at the basket, and I felt something crack inside me. The truth is, I was running out of strength too. My joints burned, my chest felt heavy with every breath. But I told no one. I didn't want pity. I only wanted to be useful. That night, as I sat by his bedside, he stirred faintly and opened his eyes. His gaze was distant, but there was something in it, something like recognition. His lips moved, forming words so faint I had to lean close to hear. "You stay too much. She doesn't like it." The words chilled me. I pulled back, searching his face for clarity, but his eyes had already closed again. I sat frozen in that chair, my heart pounding. Didn't like it? What did that mean? After everything I had done, after months of sacrificing my own life, could it be that she resented me for being there? The thought gnawed at me in the days that followed. And slowly, I began to see signs I hadn't noticed before. The way she avoided eye contact when I entered the room. The way her shoulders stiffened when I moved too close to her husband. The hushed phone calls I overheard, ending abruptly when I came near. One morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The front door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside quietly, and I heard voices, hers and another woman's. A relative, perhaps, I wasn't sure. "She's always here," the other woman said. "Doesn't she have her own life?" "She means well," my neighbor answered, but her tone was tired, almost bitter. "Sometimes I wish she'd just stop." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart breaking with every word. I wanted to walk out, to never return. But then I heard a weak cough from the bedroom, and without thinking, I went to him. Because no matter what they thought of me, I couldn't ignore him. That evening, as I prepared to leave, she followed me to the door. She looked at me with eyes that were no longer soft, no longer grateful. "You don't have to come tomorrow," she said abruptly. "We'll manage." The words struck like a blade. I forced a nod, hiding the tears that burned my eyes. But inside, I was collapsing. How could they want me gone after everything? That night, I lay awake in my own bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I truly felt the weight of what I had lost. My own life was gone, my strength, my time, my joy, all poured into their home. And now, it seemed, they wanted to shut me out of it completely. Still, the next morning, I couldn't stay away. I told myself it was duty, or love, or simply habit, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if I didn't go, something terrible would happen. So I crossed the street again, and I knocked on their door. This time it didn't open. I knocked again. Silence. Finally I heard footsteps. The door cracked open just an inch, and she stood there, her face cold. "We don't need you anymore," she said flatly. And then, before I could reply, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed in my ears, louder than any storm, sharper than any blade. And in that moment, I understood. Everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed, had been erased in a single slam of a door. But what came after that night was even worse.